It started with a gunshot. A single, deafening crack that shattered the quiet hum of a corporate high-rise. The sound echoed through the glass-walled conference room, cutting off the laughter of men in suits, freezing the half-spoken words of an assistant who had just stepped inside with fresh coffee. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone screamed. Papers scattered as a body slumped forward onto the polished mahogany table, a red stain spreading across a crisp white dress shirt. Derek Voss was dead before his phone, still connected to a Zoom call, hit the carpeted floor. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating. Then came the second shot. Unnecessary, but deliberate. A final, brutal punctuation mark. And then, a voice. Raw, shaking but certain. "You broke her heart. Now I break yours." Security cameras caught everything. The way Jake Torres stood there, hands trembling, the pearl-handled revolver, a family heirloom, dangling at his side. The way he didn't run, didn't even flinch as the first footsteps thundered toward the door. He only stood there, staring down at the man he had just killed. The police found him minutes later, still in the same spot, the gun now resting on the table beside Derek's lifeless hand. He didn't resist. He didn't protest. He only spoke once as they pushed him into the back of the squad car. "Tell Elena I fixed it." This was no random act of violence. No spur-of-the-moment outburst. This was something else. Something calculated. Because just days earlier, Derek Voss had been preparing for a wedding. His own. The invitations had been sent. The venue was booked. The woman he was set to marry, Elena Torres, had already picked out her dress. And yet, behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. Something far more sinister. Or so it seemed. Because while Elena had been choosing floral arrangements and finalizing guest lists, Derek had been sending messages to someone else. His assistant. And in those messages lay the truth. The affair. The deception. And, perhaps most chilling of all, the plan to fire his fiancée just days before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. A plan that might have worked if she hadn't left her iPad unlocked. What followed wasn't just a betrayal. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a series of choices, each one pushing a young man further toward the point of no return. But before we unravel how it all happened, before we uncover the events that led to that fatal moment, make sure you're subscribed to Beyond the Evidence. We bring you the darkest secrets behind real-life mysteries, the truths hidden beneath headlines. Hit the like button, turn on notifications, and stay with me. Because this story is far from over. It's only just beginning. Success had a face, and for Chicago's elite, that face belonged to Derek Voss. He was the kind of man people gravitated toward. A name whispered in the corridors of power, printed in glossy magazines, and spoken with admiration at black-tie events. At 45, Derek wasn't just successful. He was the kind of successful that made others want to be him. His company, Voss Technologies, had reshaped the landscape of artificial intelligence, automating entire industries and making him a multimillionaire in the process. Investors trusted him. His employees revered him. Every move he made seemed effortless, like he had cracked some invisible code to life itself. And then there was Elena Torres, the beautiful, poised, and endlessly supportive woman by his side. Their engagement had been a media sensation. Photos of them at charity galas and exclusive tech summits painted the image of a power couple on the verge of building an empire together. But images lie. There was a weight behind Derek's smile, something just beneath the surface. A sharpness in his gaze that never quite softened, even in the most intimate of moments. He carried himself with absolute control, a man who always got what he wanted. And that control extended far beyond the boardroom. Because while the world saw a visionary, those closest to him knew a different side. Derek was calculated, strategic, a master of precision, not just in business, but in people. Elena hadn't just fallen for Derek, she had been chosen, hand-picked, and to her it had felt like a fairy tale. But fairy tales only last as long as their illusion. Behind closed doors, Derek's ambition was boundless. And so was his betrayal. Because while Elena was planning their wedding, Derek was planning something else entirely. Something colder. Something cruel. And when Elena left her iPad unlocked one evening, she saw it all. The messages. The meetings. The whispered promises to Lila Weston, Derek's assistant. A woman 15 years younger, whom he had hired, mentored, and seduced. And then, the final betrayal. A draft email, still unsent, sitting there in black and white. A termination letter. For Elena. Planned for the following Monday. Days before their wedding. She stared at the screen, heart pounding, fingers hovering over the keyboard, desperate to convince herself that this wasn't real. That she was misunderstanding. That Derek wasn't. But he was. Every word was there. Clear. Unmistakable. And in that moment, something inside her cracked. A betrayal this calculated, this cold-blooded, wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision. And Derek Voss had made his. What happened next? Well, Derek never saw it coming. Because when Elena put down that iPad, she wasn't the only one who knew. Her brother, Jake Torres, had seen the messages, too. And what began as a wedding was about to become a crime scene. Stay with me, because this story is only getting darker. Elena Torres had always believed that love was supposed to feel safe. With Derek it had. Or at least, that's what she had convinced herself. Until one night, when she picked up her iPad and saw the truth staring back at her. She hadn't been looking for anything, just checking emails, flipping through the usual flood of messages. And then, as she swiped, she saw a name. Lila Weston. It wasn't the name that stopped her, it was the tone. Short, clipped responses. Then, a message with a heart emoji. Another with a "can't wait to see you tonight" attached. Her stomach twisted. Her fingers moved on their own, opening the thread. And that's when she saw it. Hundreds of messages. Some were old, buried beneath weeks of work-related conversations, brief, subtle hints of something more. Then, as the messages grew more recent, they weren't subtle anymore. Derek, I told you, she's gone before the wedding. Just wait. Lila, promise? I don't want to feel like the other woman anymore. Derek, you won't be. Monday morning, she's out. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Gone before the wedding. She read it again, her mind struggling to piece the words together. It didn't just say he was leaving her. It didn't just say he was cheating. He was planning it. With Lila. Planning to humiliate her. Fire her. Before she even had the chance to walk down the aisle. Her hands shook. Her entire body went cold. She couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. The man she was supposed to marry, the man who had kissed her good night just hours ago, was plotting against her. And then, before she could even begin to process it, before the shock could morph into tears, into anger, into anything at all, her brother walked in. Jake Torres was only 22. The kind of kid who still had his whole life ahead of him. But in that moment, staring at the screen, his expression was something unreadable. He stood behind her, silent, reading, line after line, text after text. His jaw clenched. His fingers curled into fists, his knuckles going white. For a moment, Elena thought he might say something, might ask if it was real, might try to convince her that there was some other explanation. But he didn't. He just exhaled. Long, slow. A sound that didn't belong to a 22-year-old, but to a man who had just made a decision. Then, his voice. Low. Steady. Where is he? Elena turned to look at him, finally pulling herself away from the screen. Her little brother. The one who had protected her their whole lives. And now, she saw something in his eyes. Something that made her chest tighten. Something that made her afraid. Jake had already made up his mind. And Derek was about to pay. This was no longer just an affair. This was a betrayal too cruel to ignore. And by the time Derek Voss walked into his office the next morning, sipping his coffee, straightening his tie, ready to conquer another day, he had no idea that the walls were already closing in. No idea that someone had seen. That someone knew. And that someone was coming for him. Soon. There were signs. There are always signs, the kind that make sense only in hindsight. The kind that people look back on and whisper about. I knew something was off with him. She wasn't herself that week. He was acting strange. But in the moment, no one ever sees them for what they are. Because no one ever expects things to end in blood. Jake Torres didn't talk much that week. His friends noticed. They asked him why he was skipping class, why he barely answered texts, why he seemed like he was somewhere else entirely. He just shrugged, said he was tired. No one pressed. Because who presses? Who actually looks someone in the eye and says, "Hey, man, are you planning to kill someone?" So they left him alone. And when he said he needed to clear his head, when he disappeared for hours at a time, no one questioned where he was going. But Jake wasn't clearing his head. At the gun range, his hands were steady. A paper target. A black silhouette of a man. He fired. Once. Twice. Then again. Always in the chest. Every bullet landed exactly where he wanted. The guy at the counter, an ex-cop who had seen plenty of angry men come through his doors, watched him for a while. The way he lined up each shot. The way he stood too still between rounds, staring at the target like he was imagining something else. Something real. For a second, the ex-cop considered saying something. But then Jake exhaled, shook out his shoulders, and plastered on a smirk. Stress relief, he joked. And just like that, it was over. The guy nodded. Laughed. Let him keep shooting. Because who actually believes a kid like Jake Torres is capable of murder? Elena was drinking more. She didn't realize it at first. 1 glass of wine at night to take the edge off. Then 2. Then 3. By the time she started skipping meals, by the time she was waking up with headaches and shaking hands, it didn't even feel like a choice anymore. At a cafe downtown, she sat alone. A full cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. Her eyes were puffy, red-rimmed. She had barely slept. Not since the messages. Not since she had watched Jake change. She had tried to tell herself that he was just angry, that it would pass. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, something told her the truth. Jake wasn't angry. Jake was planning something, and she wasn't sure she could stop him. Lila felt it too. She couldn't explain why. But that week, something was wrong. It was in the way Derek acted, jumpier than usual. The way his eyes flicked to his phone every few minutes. The way his hand tightened around his coffee cup, like he was bracing for bad news. She tried to ignore it. told herself it was nothing. But then the emails started. Anonymous. No sender. You should leave before it's too late. Do you know who you're sleeping with? The first time she read one, she laughed it off. By the fourth email, she wasn't laughing anymore. Derek's office had security. A doorman. Cameras. Guards stationed in the lobby. It should have been safe. But safety is just a word. And that week, as Jake stood across the street, watching, waiting, one of the security guards saw him. Noticed him lingering near the entrance, hands shoved deep into his pockets. For a moment, he hesitated. Thought about walking over, asking what the kid was doing there. But then his radio buzzed. Someone needed him inside. So he turned away. And Jake stayed, watching, because he was waiting for the right moment. And soon it would come. It was all leading to something. All of it. The silence. The sleepless nights. The gun range. The emails. The unanswered questions. Something had already started. And no one, not Derek, not Lila, not even Elena, could stop it now. Because the clock was already counting down. And when it hit 0, blood would be spilled. Stay with me. Because what happens next? It changes everything. It happened fast. That's how these things always go. The build-up takes weeks, sometimes months. The tension simmers. The signs appear. People notice, but they shrug it off. They tell themselves it's nothing, that everything will blow over. And then, 1 second changes everything. 3:45 p.m. Derek Voss was laughing. The walls of his office muffled the city noise outside. His corner suite, glass everywhere, sleek furniture, expensive, was bathed in afternoon light. A Zoom call was open on his laptop, a meeting with investors. They were smiling. He was winning them over. This was the Derek Voss everyone knew, the man with a plan, the man who always landed on his feet, the man who could talk his way out of anything, including betrayal. 3:46 p.m. Jake Torres stepped into the building. Security footage would later show him entering through the revolving doors, walking straight past the front desk. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate. If anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his right hand gripped the something under his jacket. But no one did, because no one ever does. A receptionist glanced up, distracted, then back at her screen. A security guard looked over, but Jake's face was calm, blank. There was nothing alarming about him. Just a young man in a hoodie. A nobody. Harmless. 3:46 and 30 seconds p.m. The elevator dinged. Jake stepped inside. A woman got in with him, talking on the phone. She barely noticed him, too caught up in whatever conversation she was having. If she had looked at him, really looked, she might have seen the way his fingers twitched, the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed. But she didn't. No one ever does. 3:47 p.m. Derek was mid-sentence. He was leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. Some joke had just landed well with the investors on the call. They were smiling. Someone chuckled. Then, the door slammed open. 3:47 and 12 seconds p.m. The security cameras caught everything. Derek's assistant, Lila, flinched at the noise. She turned. Her mouth opened to speak, to ask who the hell was barging in like that. But then she saw the gun, and the words died in her throat. 3:47 and 15 seconds p.m. Derek froze. For a split second, his brain struggled to catch up. He blinked at the figure in his doorway, Jake, breathing hard, eyes dark, wild. The gun was raised, pointed straight at him. And in that moment, something flickered across Derek's face. Recognition. Fear. And then, the first shot. 3:47 and 16 seconds p.m. The bullet hit center mass. Derek jerked back. His chair tipped, slammed against the window. Lila screamed. The Zoom call froze. The investors on the screen, laughing just seconds ago, went rigid. A woman gasped. A man yelled something. Then, the second shot. 3:47 and 18 seconds p.m. Derek collapsed. Blood spread across his shirt. His body twitched. His lips parted, like he was trying to say something. Maybe a plea. Maybe a curse. Jake stepped closer. Lila was crying, shaking, pressing herself against the desk, too afraid to move. Derek looked up at him. And then, the third shot. Straight to the head. Everything stopped. 3:47 and 22 seconds p.m. The room smelled like gunpowder. Like blood. Lila wasn't screaming anymore. Just staring. Shaking. On the laptop screen, the investors sat frozen, some in shock, some reaching for their phones, all watching. Derek wasn't moving. His eyes were still open. But he was gone. 3:48 p.m. Jake was crying. The gun, his shaking hands dropped it. It clattered against the floor. He looked down at Derek's body. Then up at Lila. Then back down. His shoulders heaved. His mouth opened, like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Footsteps, pounding down the hall. Then, security. 3:49 p.m. Jake didn't run. He didn't fight. He barely moved as 4 men tackled him to the floor, arms wrenched behind his back, a knee pressed hard against his spine. Somewhere outside, sirens wailed. Inside, Lila sobbed. And Derek Voss, Chicago's golden boy, the man with everything, lay dead in his office, blood pooling beneath him. A frozen Zoom call on his laptop. And Jake Torres? Jake just kept crying. Because it was over. And nothing could change what he had done. But here's the thing. What everyone would soon learn, what the world would whisper about for years to come, was that the worst part wasn't the crime itself. It was what happened after. Because Derek Voss wasn't finished. And neither was this story. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. That after the gunshots, after the sirens, after Jake Torres was dragged away in handcuffs, life just moved on. But murder doesn't work that way. Death leaves a stain. And Derek Voss's blood was impossible to wash away. The world reacts. It took 30 minutes for the first news alert to hit. By nightfall, every major network had the footage, the security camera stills, the Zoom call freeze frame, the blood-slicked office floor. Tech mogul gunned down by fiancé's brother. A crime of passion or premeditated execution. Who was Jake Torres? News anchors sat behind glossy desks, their voices grave, as if they had known Derek personally. Cameras panned to the crowds outside the courthouse, the protest signs, the arguments spilling into the streets. Some called Jake a monster. Others called him a martyr. And then there were the ones who whispered, who claimed that maybe, just maybe, Derek Voss got exactly what he deserved. Elena Torres, the grieving fiancée. Elena never spoke publicly about what happened. Not in interviews. Not in statements. Not even on social media. She just vanished. For weeks, photographers hunted her down. Outside her apartment, outside the funeral home, outside her lawyer's office. And when she finally emerged, it wasn't for an interview. It was for a charity gala. Derek's name was still fresh in the headlines when she walked into the ballroom, shoulders squared, chin high, ignoring the flashing cameras. There was no mourning veil, no black dress. Just Elena Torres, in silk and diamonds, standing in front of the press Derek once controlled. She took the money, the life insurance, the inheritance, every cent of it. Not for revenge. Not for herself. But to start a non-profit. For victims of domestic abuse. For women who had been trapped in the kind of relationships that ended in fear, in betrayal, in blood. For people like her. When reporters shoved microphones at her, asking if it was a statement against Derek, against his legacy, against the crime that took him, she simply smiled. And walked away. Lila, the woman who vanished. If Elena disappeared into the spotlight, Lila disappeared into the shadows. She quit her job, deleted her social media, and then she was gone. No one saw her at the trial. No one saw her at the funeral. No one saw her anywhere. Some said she fled the country. Others swore they saw her wandering the streets at night, disheveled, mumbling to herself. But one thing was certain. Lila was never the same. And maybe, just maybe, she knew something the rest of us didn't. The internet erupts. Online, the story refused to die. Social media turned Jake Torres into a symbol. The hashtags flooded timelines. Hashtag justice for Jake. Hashtag Derek got what he deserved. Hashtag cold-blooded murder. Some people called Jake a hero. A brother who did what had to be done. A man who took justice into his own hands when the system would have failed. Others saw a killer. A man who let his anger pull the trigger. A murderer who made himself judge, jury, and executioner. The debates raged. Was it vigilante justice, or was it cold-blooded murder? Even now, people still argue about it. And I guess the real question isn't what happened that day. It's what happened after. Because for all the headlines, for all the discussions, for all the people who thought they understood the story, they didn't know the worst part. They didn't know what was still coming. Because Derek Voss, he wasn't finished. Not yet. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every breath held. It felt less like a trial and more like a spectacle. A circus of flashing cameras, furious whispers, and divided loyalties. Because Jake Torres wasn't just a man on trial. He was a symbol. The state of Illinois versus Jake Torres. The prosecution called it murder. Cold-blooded. Premeditated. An execution in broad daylight. They painted Jake as unhinged. A ticking bomb who had planned Derek's death the moment he found those texts. They showed the gun range receipts. The security footage of Jake lingering outside Derek's office. The anger in his voice when he texted Elena. I swear to God, I'll make him pay. And then, of course, the footage. 3 shots. 1, 2, 3. Derek's body slumped over his desk, blood pooling beneath him as the Zoom call froze in time. An entire courtroom watched him die. Again. And again. And again. The jury didn't flinch. But Elena did. The defense, a crime of passion? Jake's lawyer fought tooth and nail. They called it a crime of passion. An act of desperation. A man pushed too far. They played the texts from Derek and Lila, the ones about getting rid of Elena. They showed pictures of Elena after she found out. Sunken eyes, trembling hands, sleepless nights. And then they asked the jury, would you have just stood by? Would you have let him get away with it? Would you have done anything different? Silence. That was the thing about justice. Everyone thought they wanted it, until it came with blood on its hands. The verdict. It took the jury 2 days to decide. And when the foreman stood, the world held its breath. Jake Torres, guilty of second-degree murder. 15 years. Possibility of parole in 10. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elena shut her eyes. Jake didn't react. No tears. No anger. No outburst. Just acceptance. Like he had known, all along, that this was how his story would end. The final shot. The cameras were there the day he walked free. Older. Thinner. A ghost of the man he used to be. He stepped outside the prison gates, blinking against the sunlight, breathing air that wasn't stale, free for the first time in a decade. No family waiting. No friends. Just the weight of everything he had done. And as he took that first step forward, the debate raged on. Justice, or just another tragedy? People are still arguing, even now. But the truth is worse than any of them know. Because for all the years that passed, for all the people who thought this story was over, Jake Torres still swears, to this day, that he's not alone, that Derek never left, and that some nights, when the air is too still, when the lights flicker just so, he hears him, breathing, laughing, waiting. What do you think? Was Jake's revenge justified, or was it a tragic mistake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found this case as shocking as we did, and make sure you're subscribed to Beyond the Evidence for more deep dives into real-life crimes that will leave you questioning everything. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a twist, because behind every story, there's always more lurking in the shadows.